I thought let us look at the systems in which we operate from. One is the organizational systems. We are all living in family, society, business organizations, non-profit, religious, variety of them. In addition to that, the measures that we operate with a lot more are financial. So there is a lot more about metrics and a lot more about how do we create value, how do we measure value. To a certain extent, business has become more dominant than many other systems these days. At some level, President Obama has less influence than probably the president of Microsoft or president of Starbucks, because they essentially work across geographical boundaries. On the third and most important part is to look at the idea of spirituality. And last week, I think April 7th issue of Fortune magazine talked about 50 greatest leaders from around the world. And this time, number one is a Pope. This time they believe that what he has been able to bring, not just in Christians, but in non-Christians as well, just like Dalai Lama had done for Buddhism and for non-Buddhists, it looks like there is something about a way a religious leader can bring about a sense of spirituality, purpose and meaning of a different kind. I do believe in the middle of these technological and scientific systems, organizational and business systems, and spiritual and religious systems, somewhere in between, because we operate between the three all the time, we have to ignite the genius within us. Whether it is in Cincinnati, whether it is in South Africa, whether it is in dealing with the polarities that we deal with, we have to figure out to ignite the genius of ourselves and genius of each other, because that's the only way we can actually become successful as we go forward. But to do that in the times of complexity is much harder. John Seely Brown, who used to be in Xerox PARC for a long time, and he's a thought leader, he says, we are not leading in terms of major disruptive changes with a large amount of space in between and then another disruptive change. That's not how the world is happening right now. There are lots of disruptive changes that occur. Within a short period of time, there is another disruption, another disruption. So he says, we live in a state of constant disequilibrium. That is the normal state of complexity. Nancy, when she will talk about, she will go into the complex adaptive systems a lot more. But I just want to say, where we live in has never been lived before. The diversity, interdependence, scarcity, ambiguity, all of these are the nature of world that we live in, and the polarities are something that we have to pay a lot of attention to. Sure. See, I told you, we need to live in the middle of technology, value creation. It happens, right? You just don't have to really look at anything else. Now, in the middle of all that, the measure several times we look at individually, whether we are individually having a personal leadership scenario or organizational or a community leadership scenario, it comes down to how successful are we? And are we successful or are we stuck? Let me just begin with, because many times we talk about success related to certain people, smart people. I just want to know how many of you perceive yourself to be smart? Excellent. And it would be interesting that around your tables you need to have conversations about other people who are in the room who haven't raised their hand. Maybe, the breakfast and coffee was kind of pulling on them, but I'm sure if you are in this Systems Thinking in Action conference, and if you don't frame yourself as smart, I think we need some conversations to have. Second, how many of you have been successful in the past? Very interesting. So most of the people have been successful in one area or another, or one time or another. Now, any of you been stuck in the past? Yeah, if you haven't raised your hand, probably you are not necessarily being honest or in a state of lack of awareness. That's okay. That's okay. I found that I actually produce between two states of stuckness. Majority of the time, between one state of stuckness and other state, I might have a lot of productivity and meaning, but then I'll go right back to what I have done before. So, for example, how many of you stuck now? Let me raise my hand actually.
In some aspect of it.
Yeah, some aspect or other. It's just look around. We have smart people, successful people, capable people, people who teach, people who are lead organizations, who coach, consult with people around the world, but we ourselves come from a place of sometimes stuckness. The reason is, like Warren Bennis calls, it just like in chemistry we talk about, it's like a state of disequilibrium at some level. It's a fluid disequilibrium. Somehow, somewhere we need to figure out a way to take it to from stuckness in somewhere else. Of course, as we know, what gets us stuck many times is sometimes thinking. Of course, the more accurate way of saying is having thoughts, because thinking is quite different. A philosopher, he said it, in these times of thought-provoking days, most thought-provoking is that human beings still have a lot of thoughts, but they rarely think. So it's an interesting scenario. And for some of you who didn't understand, I have to stick my tongue out in the name of making thinking as clear. I was told when I went to a speech pathologist, thinking, I have to stick my tongue out a little bit and press it so that thinking comes. But I haven't figured out how much I should stick my tongue out in the name of making myself clear. So in case you don't understand, just check that out one way or another. So finally, when you get out of stuckness, what got you out of stuckness? Majority of the times, it is not the thought or thinking, it is mostly action. So interesting perspective is, if you really look at where is your foot nailed to the floor, it is generally assumed that it is something that you failed, something that you didn't know, something that you were unsuccessful. But what we found out was, after studying a large number of leaders, it is usually your past success that gets you stuck. In some respects, the signature strength of yesterday, when it is inappropriately used today, that gets you stuck. I actually call that as core incompetence. I know, we all know about core competence. The whole outsourcing industry came out of core competence, but what we don't pay attention to is what was core competence in 1990s. By over attending to some of that has become core incompetence today. If you notice, both in industries as well as in individual scenario, what got you here won't get you there. There is even a book by Marshall Goldsmith basically saying inappropriate use of what got you here is the one that gets you stuck most of the time. So just reflect on some of these a little bit, because action is the one not only that breaks you out of stuckness, but many actions when people take, some lead to disaster, folly, some lead to turnaround or transformation. So let me give some two examples, very recent examples. This is the way in which Ford was described in 2006 when local hero in Seattle, Alan Mulally, who created remarkable 777 planes, chose to leave aerospace industry and went to Ford Motor Company. These are some of the descriptions that were in the press. It didn't look very good, because even in 2008, it was like a Ford stock was like a junk bond status. It was like $1 a stock. Like we have Jeremy, who used to work with Ford quite a bit. You can talk more about it when you have a chance to talk to him. Then they brought Alan Mulally in. Of course, as I said, Alan Mulally had been extremely successful with the 777. And just last week in the same Fortune magazine, he was rated as number 3, right behind Pope, and then right behind the the Chancellor of Germany. He is the one who is rated as the greatest CEO at this moment, number 3 listed. And by the way, as of March 31st, Ford USA profits were like $7 billion. They gave $8,800 bonus to 47,000 UAW employees this year. That was a remarkable turnaround. They did not take the money from the government as bailout, and they took a completely different path, and they brought a turnaround. So Alan Mulally was able to bring his track record, apply it in the current context in a complex, different industry than what he has been used to, and brought some magic. On the other hand, let's look at another example. This was actually covered again about JCPenney. And they had generally, lots of areas, like description again, it is still there in the street 2014, it says, these are all the various things they say that has been a problem that has been plaguing JCPenney before, and they continue to plague right now. In between, the stock had again significantly reduced when compared to the retail trade industry, and they brought in a hero again. They brought another leader who has a great track record. Ron Johnson was the CEO of Target. Target, he had been very successful. He was hired by Steve Jobs to help him create the Apple stores. As probably some of you know, Apple stores have been the major revolution in the retail. Actually, when Steve Jobs wanted to start Apple stores, his own board of directors said no to him, but he went ahead and believed that the stores are completely different, and he created, and they make $6,000 per square foot. The next closest is Tiffany Jewelers in Manhattan. Just to give you an example, JCPenney makes $150 per square foot. So these are like completely different range. And of course, he was brought in and he got hero's welcome. As a matter of fact, just by the announcement that he was going in as a CEO, JCPenney's stock went up, I think something like 19%, just by the name that this person coming in. But unfortunately, he tried to work in JCPenney the way in which he worked with Apple. So he tried to bring in the premier brand thinking into commodities situation in JCPenney. He tried to create stores within stores to remove the sales, remove various kinds of stuff. What it meant is, while Ford led to turnaround situation through Alan Mulally, JCPenney got fired within 11 months. And the old CEO was brought back, and they are still going through. That means using the best practices from somewhere else and trying to bring it into our own life or our own companies may not work. If what worked before doesn't work, what worked for somebody else doesn't work, what we have done before does not lead to, how do you really bring about something else, some change? I believe the most effective way to do that is to recognize between the meaning and sustainability. If these are the two, what you might call axes that you can work with, when you do something that is sustainable over time and that is meaningful, that is what I call wise leadership. But when it is neither meaningful and it is superficial, I would say that is when we are stuck. There are two paths to do it. One is data and activity driven approach. Some smart people who focus on lot more on a business smartness, and they try to take it the bottom right approach. Some other people who are functionally experts, who are very good in doing what they are doing in their own silos, they use their instincts and their past success driven behavior to get that. As a matter of fact, this is again a polarity. If you look at in the book which we wrote called From Smart to Wise, we talked about functional smartness. For example, anybody who is good in their field, their area, including several Nobel laureates I interviewed, they are very good in being their functional smartness. Whereas some other entrepreneurs who think outside the box, who connect the dots, who sees the patterns, are business smart people. In between the stuckness and the polarity, there is a huge area of wise leadership. You can assess yourself if you go to that site for free. And the key I found to get out of this particular kind of stuckness, it again is a systemic and it is cyclic way of doing it. It's an iterative process of developing awareness. I found out many models that are used do not work because we focus on knowledge instead of awareness, and our mindset gets in the way of applying something. Alan Mulally was aware of the context and worked with it. And similarly, attention is not same as tunnel vision, and action is not a checklist based activity. And reflection, I'm glad we just did a reflection between the first session and this session, because reflections are most important. Like Jalaluddin Rumi says, how can I ever polish your mirror if you keep getting irritated at every rub? So the key is that every speaker will create the rub we need to figure out. So what you may want to look at is your cognitive biases, and your own planning based, thinking based approaches don't work. We have to figure out, ultimately it is a leadership that we can demonstrate is decisions, actions and communication. So I recommend, if you want to be wise, do rapid prototyping. Develop an entrepreneurial or a beginner's mindset. Fail fast, fail forward, learn from it, use the reflection and figure out a way to do something else. Don't try to think all of it before you go. So what I recommend to stop my talk is, if you can think about today, tomorrow in open space, or when you go back, think about one action, one decision and one communication. Think about, instead of being smarter, in my own way, can I be wiser in that action? Can I make a wiser decision? When I communicate, can I pay attention to how will this communication gets received? And I recommend for 30 days, if you can take on every day to add one more action or visit or decision in a wiser scenario, I have a feeling after 1 month, we will have much calmer, wiser decisions and actions being taken by us, whether it is in our personal lives or in organizations. I hope that is probably the most effective way in which we can spread the genius, and we can create a context in which together we can create a world that we all dreamt about and that we are really happy to live in. Thank you very much.